January 1944. Berlin, before dawn. The city is still dark when the first reports arrive. Radar stations along the coast have already tracked the formations forming over the North Sea. Their altitude is familiar. Their direction is familiar. Even the estimated timing is familiar enough to be penciled in without urgency. Inside the Reich Chancellery, Adolf Hitler stands over a large situation map spread across a heavy table. Red circles mark German cities struck in previous weeks. New lines are drawn over old ones, almost tracing themselves. Hamburg again. Bremen again. Industrial zones already damaged, targeted once more before repairs are complete. Hitler says little. He listens. He watches aides point to routes that no longer surprise anyone in the room. The bombers are not wandering. They are not hesitating. They are arriving as if guided, cutting through weather and defenses with an assurance Germany was never meant to face. For years, German planning assumed bombing would be chaotic, disrupted by flak, scattered by fighters, defeated by endurance. Yet what now confronts him is something different. Not randomness, not luck, repetition. Hitler studies the map longer than usual. The silence stretches. The meaning is beginning to settle in. If the enemy can return this reliably, then Germany is no longer being attacked. It is being systematically found. That quiet realization opens a question Hitler cannot yet answer, but one that will soon dominate the war above Germany. Long before American bombers appeared regularly over German cities, the outcome of the air war had already been shaped by belief. German air doctrine before the war rested on a simple conviction. Bombing was a weapon of disruption, not decision. Aircraft were vulnerable. Crews were human. Weather was unpredictable. Even the most determined attacker, German planners believed, would eventually be forced to scatter, retreat, or abandon precision altogether. This conviction shaped the Luftwaffe from its first days. It was designed as an instrument of speed and shock, supporting ground forces rather than waging independent campaigns. German bombers were medium range. Fighters were optimized for interception near friendly territory. There was no serious plan for defending against a sustained, long-range daylight assault by a distant enemy. Early victories appeared to validate this approach. In Poland and France, air power shattered resistance quickly. Ground operations moved faster than opponents could react. The Luftwaffe dominated skies that were poorly defended and poorly coordinated. But the Battle of Britain exposed the limits of this confidence. German bombers flying without adequate long-range escort suffered heavy losses. British radar, centralized command, and layered defense systems prevented the collapse German leaders had expected. The campaign stalled. Rather than re-examining assumptions, Berlin drew a more convenient lesson. Bombing alone could not force a decisive outcome. This conclusion hardened over time. When Britain shifted to night bombing, German confidence deepened. RAF crews avoided daylight defenses but sacrificed accuracy. Cities were struck but often imprecisely. Targets were missed. Damage was real, but uneven. German officials concluded that bombing, even when persistent, could be endured. Hitler absorbed this lesson fully. He believed morale mattered more than factories. German civilians, he assumed, would adapt to air raids as they had adapted to shortages and hardship. Industry could disperse. Repairs could follow destruction. The Reich would bend, but not break. By the time Germany invaded the Soviet Union, air defense planning reflected this confidence. Radar coverage expanded. Flak batteries multiplied. Fighter sectors were organized to respond quickly. On paper, Germany was well protected. What these defenses were built to defeat was an enemy who struggled to find targets. They were not designed to stop one who could return to them repeatedly. The entry of the United States into the war in December 1941 did not immediately alter German expectations. American air power was large in theory, but untested in Europe. German intelligence viewed U.S. doctrine, daylight precision bombing, as naive. Precision under combat conditions, especially over hostile territory, was assumed to be impossible. Goering dismissed the threat openly. German reports emphasized American inexperience. Losses, they predicted, would be severe enough to force a shift toward night bombing, just as the British had done. Hitler accepted these assessments without difficulty. They aligned perfectly with his existing worldview. The first American raids in 1942 seemed to confirm them. Small formations appeared over occupied Europe. German fighters intercepted effectively. Bombers were lost. Damage was limited. From Berlin, the air war still looked controllable. What Hitler did not yet see was that these early raids were not meant to prove dominance. They were meant to prove procedure. The Americans were not testing Germany's defenses. They were learning how to pass through them. And once learned, that path would be used again. By 1943, the difference between German expectation and American intent began to widen in ways Berlin did not immediately recognize. Across eastern England, airfields expanded steadily. Runways were lengthened. Control towers appeared where hedgerows once stood. To German reconnaissance, the buildup was visible but misleading. Aircraft on the ground did not yet translate into pressure in the air. Numbers alone had never decided wars in German experience. Hitler's focus remained elsewhere. The Eastern Front absorbed attention and resources. Stalingrad had already revealed how quickly confidence could collapse on land. In comparison, the air war still appeared secondary, dangerous, costly, but ultimately manageable. American strategy unfolded differently. The U.S. Army Air Forces committed fully to daylight bombing. Tight formations, mutual defensive fire, and centralized control were meant to replace stealth with structure. It was a gamble. Even Allied leaders questioned whether it could succeed. German defenses initially responded as expected. Early deep raids, particularly against Schweinfurt and Regensburg, inflicted heavy American losses. Fighters broke into formations. Flak found its range. Crews were shot down in numbers that appeared unsustainable. Inside Hitler's headquarters, these battles reinforced confidence. Goering assured him that American casualties far exceeded German losses. Reports emphasized enemy aircraft destroyed rather than German pilots lost. The conclusion seemed obvious. Daylight bombing could not last. But the Americans did not retreat. They adjusted. Aircraft production increased rather than slowed. Training pipelines expanded. Losses were absorbed, analyzed, and corrected. New escort fighters began appearing in greater numbers. First, the P-47 Thunderbolt pushed deeper into German airspace. Then the P-51 Mustang arrived, capable of escorting bombers from England to central Germany and back. This development struck at the heart of German air defense planning. For years, German fighters had relied on the assumption that bombers would arrive alone, vulnerable once they crossed a certain distance. Now that assumption collapsed. Escorts did not turn back at the frontier. They stayed with the bombers, challenging German fighters wherever they gathered. Hitler was informed of these changes gradually. The reports were cautious. They emphasized technological innovation, rather than structural failure. Yet outcomes told a different story. American formations began returning with increasing consistency. Targets previously struck were attacked again. Weather that once grounded operations no longer prevented raids. German radar operators noticed patterns that no longer varied significantly. The bombers were no longer improvising. They were following a system. Factories damaged in earlier attacks were struck before repairs could be completed. Rail yards repaired under emergency schedules were destroyed again within weeks. Oil facilities, once thought too difficult to cripple permanently, became recurring targets. Hitler noticed these repetitions. Situation maps grew crowded with overlapping markings. Cities circled once were circled again. Routes reused. Timings anticipated. The implication was unsettling. Precision had not failed under combat. It had matured. What had once seemed reckless now appeared deliberate. American air power was no longer testing German defenses. It was applying pressure steadily, learning from every encounter, improving with each return. By late 1943, the air war had become something Germany had never planned for. Not a series of raids, not a contest of morale, but a sustained process of denial. And for the first time, Hitler began to suspect that the enemy overhead was not merely attacking Germany. It was studying it. That suspicion would soon deepen as the war in the air revealed itself from multiple angles: human, tactical, and political. each reinforcing the same conclusion. The first angle through which Hitler began to understand what was happening unfolded far from his map table, inside the aircraft themselves. For American bomber crews, repetition was not an accident. It was doctrine. Crews studied routes until they became familiar shapes rather than unknown distances. They learned where flak was thickest, where fighters usually appeared, where clouds most often broke. Missions were not isolated events, but parts of a sequence, each one refining the next. German intelligence reports captured fragments of this reality. Crews flying straight through heavy fire, formations holding together even as aircraft fell away, bombs released with mechanical coordination rather than individual judgment. This behavior contradicted German expectations. Luftwaffe doctrine assumed sustained losses would shatter bomber morale. Instead, cohesion increased. The second angle was tactical, and it cut even deeper. German air defenses were designed to disrupt, break formations, scatter bombers, force inaccuracy. Fighters attacked aggressively. Flak belts layered the sky. The system assumed that chaos would follow pressure. But the Americans responded with structure rather than improvisation. Formations tightened. Leadership aircraft controlled entire groups. If one bomber was damaged, another took its place in the formation. Even when German defenses inflicted losses, the remaining aircraft continued toward the target. The result was unsettling. Damage was inflicted, but objectives were still achieved. Hitler began to sense that German defenses were no longer dictating outcomes. They were reacting to a system that absorbed punishment without collapsing. Losses that should have disrupted operations were being accepted as part of the process. The third angle was technological. Though Hitler encountered it only through results, American bombers were reaching targets through cloud cover that should have forced cancellation. Raids arrived when weather forecasts predicted failure. Targets already struck were hit again despite smoke, damage, and altered terrain. Behind this consistency lay navigation aids Germany had underestimated: radar-assisted bombing, improved formation control, and pathfinder techniques that reduced reliance on visual cues. These systems did not eliminate error, but they reduced uncertainty. For Hitler, uncertainty had always been a defensive ally. Weather, chance, and confusion were supposed to favor the defender. Now those variables were shrinking. The fourth angle was leadership. Hitler's style depended on belief in control. Setbacks could be explained, failures could be blamed, reversals could be postponed. Repetition disrupted that framework. When the same result occurred again and again, explanations lost credibility. Goering continued to promise reversal. Fighter leaders reported exhaustion. Industrial officials warned of cumulative damage. Hitler listened to all of it and trusted less with each passing week. The air war was no longer producing surprises. It was producing patterns, and patterns implied planning. This was the moment when Hitler's suspicion moved beyond tactics and technology. The enemy overhead was not merely powerful, it was organized to endure, to learn, and to return without hesitation. That realization did not yet bring panic, but it narrowed Hitler's options sharply. Because if the enemy could repeat success indefinitely, then Germany's defenses were no longer a shield, they were a delay. And delays, in a war of systems, only favor the side that can afford to wait. That truth would be forced into full clarity during the winter and spring of 1944, when repetition ceased to be unsettling and became undeniable. The winter of 1943-44 stripped away the last ambiguity. By January, American bomber operations over Germany no longer felt episodic. They felt continuous. Radar warnings became routine. Fighter units were scrambled so often that readiness itself began to erode. Even on days without major raids, reconnaissance aircraft probed airspace, forcing defenses to remain alert without respite. Hitler watched the situation harden. Daily reports no longer emphasized dramatic victories or losses. They read like production logs. Targets struck, damage assessed, interceptions attempted, fuel expended. The same cities appeared again and again. Industrial zones hit in November were struck again in December and again in January. Repairs never fully caught up before the next attack arrived. This was the turning point. Hitler began demanding overlays, maps that showed not a single raid, but many. When these were laid out, the pattern was unmistakable. Routes repeated with minor variation, timing consistent enough to anticipate, altitudes adjusted just enough to blunt flak effectiveness. German defenses were no longer forcing the enemy to adapt. The enemy was shaping German response. The Luftwaffe felt the pressure immediately. Fighter losses climbed sharply as escort fighters remained with bomber formations deeper into the Reich. Engagements grew longer and more punishing. Pilots returned exhausted, if they returned at all. Training hours were cut as fuel became scarce. New pilots arrived with minimal preparation and were lost quickly. Hitler was told of these losses cautiously. Goering emphasized aircraft production figures, pointing to increasing numbers leaving factories. But aircraft without trained pilots offered little reassurance. Hitler understood attrition. He had accepted it on the Eastern Front. In the air, it was becoming decisive. The decisive realization came as German oil production began to fall measurably. Refineries and synthetic fuel plants were struck repeatedly. Repairs were attempted under constant threat. Output declined week by week. Fighter units reported shortages. Training programs were suspended. Even successful interceptions were weighed against fuel consumed. This was the confirmation Hitler had been resisting. The Americans were not simply destroying targets. They were removing Germany's ability to sustain defense itself. Every raid weakened the next response. Every return reduced German capacity to resist future ones. At this point, Hitler's suspicion hardened into certainty. The enemy overhead was not relying on chance, courage, or sacrifice alone. It was operating a system designed to return indefinitely, to improve continuously, and to deny recovery altogether. Orders grew sharper. New weapons were demanded urgently. Jet aircraft were pushed into service before readiness. Flak production was increased despite shortages elsewhere. Underground factories were expanded at enormous cost. None of it changed the pattern. The bombers continued to return. By spring 1944, control of German airspace was no longer contested in principle. It was contested in desperation. The Luftwaffe fought not to dominate the sky, but to survive beneath it. Hitler did not announce this shift. He did not concede it publicly. But his decisions reflected a quiet acceptance of the truth. Germany was no longer shaping the air war. It was enduring it. And endurance, in this contest, belonged to the enemy. That realization set the stage for consequences that would extend far beyond the skies over Germany. The effects of Hitler's realization spread quickly, even as they remained largely unspoken. By mid-1944, German air defenses were operating under permanent strain. Flak batteries fired relentlessly, wearing out barrels and crews alike. Ammunition shortages forced rationing even as raids intensified. Cities once thought secure now lived under constant alert, their defenses locked in a cycle of reaction rather than control. The Luftwaffe's decline accelerated sharply. Veteran pilots, men with years of experience, were lost faster than they could be replaced. New pilots arrived with only basic training, sent into combat against opponents who controlled altitude, timing, and engagement. Survival rates collapsed. Units that once dominated European skies now fought simply to contest them. Fuel shortages made the situation irreversible. Synthetic fuel plants and refineries, struck repeatedly, could not sustain output. Fighter units were grounded not by defeat in combat, but by empty tanks. Training hours were slashed. Entire squadrons were held back for emergencies that came daily. Hitler was fully aware of these constraints. Reports no longer attempted optimism. They described limits, thresholds, points beyond which operations could not continue. The language itself reflected surrender, not of will but of capacity. Industry, too, began to fracture under repetition. Dispersal and underground production delayed collapse but could not prevent it. Transportation networks failed under sustained attack. Materials arrived late or not at all. Finished weapons accumulated uselessly, unable to reach front lines. Civilian morale followed a similar arc. Bombing ceased to shock and began to exhaust. Reconstruction was temporary. Displacement became routine. The expectation of relief vanished. People endured not because they believed in victory, but because endurance was the only option left. For Hitler, the air war had become a condition rather than a problem to solve. His focus shifted toward weapons that promised reversal without addressing underlying imbalance. Jets, rockets, defensive marvels meant to restore initiative. None of them succeeded. American bombers continued to return with the same certainty that had first sparked suspicion months earlier. Escorts dominated the airspace. Reconnaissance aircraft ranged freely. German movements were observed, tracked, and attacked before they could gather momentum. By the time Allied ground forces moved across Western Europe, the outcome had already been shaped above them. German armies moved cautiously, constrained by air attack. Supply lines faltered. Concentration invited destruction. The air war had not ended the conflict by itself, but it had stripped Germany of the ability to resist effectively when the decisive moment arrived. What remained was a war fought under constant observation, constant pressure, and diminishing choice. And that condition, once established, could not be reversed. The moment Adolf Hitler first suspected that American bombers were no longer finding German cities by chance did not arrive in fire or chaos. It arrived in repetition. For decades, air power had been treated as an instrument of shock, terrifying, destructive, but ultimately limited by weather, navigation, and human endurance. Germany built its defenses on that assumption. Damage could be repaired. Morale could be hardened. Time, Hitler believed, would always favor those who could endure longest. The American air campaign overturned that logic quietly. It did not seek a single decisive blow. It did not rely on terror alone. Instead, it introduced a new form of warfare, one driven by systems rather than moments, by consistency rather than surprise. Targets did not need to be destroyed once if they could be denied function again and again. Defenses did not need to fail catastrophically if they could be exhausted beyond recovery. Hitler understood this too late. His suspicion, formed through maps layered with overlapping raids and reports stripped of optimism, recognized a reality that ideology could not undo. The enemy overhead was not improvising. It was learning, improving, returning with certainty. In that realization lay the true defeat of German air defense, not in any single raid, but in the loss of control over time itself. The skies no longer offered unpredictability. They offered inevitability. When the war finally ended on the ground, the decisive battles had already been fought above. Fuel was gone, industry was fractured, movement was exposed. Choice had narrowed to endurance alone. History often remembers the destruction, the shattered cities, the burning factories. But the deeper transformation lay in what those bombers represented, a future in which wars would be decided not by dramatic moments, but by the steady application of pressure that never needed to stop. They did not need to surprise Germany. They only needed to return.